One summer, a group of close friends, Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Mark, decided to venture deep into the woods for a weekend of camping. They chose an isolated area in a national park, miles away from the nearest town. The air was thick with the scents of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was broken only by the rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. It was perfect for an escape from their busy city lives. They set up camp near a small clearing by the lake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group huddled around the crackling fire, sharing ghost stories and laughing at each other's jumps and gasps. But as the night wore on, the lighthearted mood began to shift. It started with a faint noise, a distant, almost imperceptible humming sound that none of them could pinpoint. "Probably just the wind," Jake muttered, though his voice betrayed his unease. The noise grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural hum that seemed to pulse in their ears. It was unlike anything they'd ever heard. Sarah, always the skeptic, decided to investigate, her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The others reluctantly followed, their feet crunching over twigs and dry leaves. The noise seemed to come from deeper within the woods, luring them away from the safety of their camp. As they ventured further, they stumbled upon a strange sight, a ring of moss-covered stones arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a weathered wooden totem jutted from the ground, its surface carved with symbols none of them could recognize. A foul smell lingered in the air, a mix of rotting flesh and damp earth. Emily recoiled, her hand covering her nose. "Let's go back," she whispered, her voice trembling. But before they could turn, the humming stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into an unsettling silence. Then came the whispering, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction at once. Flashlights flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. Panic set in, and they sprinted back toward their camp, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. When they reached the clearing, something was wrong. Their tent was gone, replaced by the same stone circle they had just fled. The fire was extinguished, the ground around it damp and cold. Mark frantically searched for their supplies, but everything was gone. No food, no water, no gear. Only the oppressive silence remained. Then the whispers began again, closer this time. Shadows moved unnaturally at the edge of the clearing, and a sense of dread weighed heavily on the group. Jake picked up a thick branch, gripping it tightly as if it could protect them. "We have to leave, now," he said, his voice barely audible. But as they tried to retrace their steps, the forest seemed to shift around them. Trails they had walked earlier were now overgrown, paths twisted in impossible directions. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches resembling skeletal hands. Emily cried out in pain, clutching her arm. A deep, jagged scratch ran from her shoulder to her wrist, though no one had touched her. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt warped. Exhausted and terrified, the group stumbled upon a cabin. Its walls were weathered and cracked, the windows dark and uninviting. Desperation outweighed caution, and they pushed the creaking door open. Inside, the air was stifling, filled with the same foul stench from the totem. Strange symbols were etched into the wooden walls, and a single lantern flickered weakly in the corner. A notebook lay open on a dusty table, its pages filled with frantic scrawls. "Don't trust the whispers. Don't follow the trails. It watches, always." The last entry read, "If you hear the humming, it's already too late." The lantern flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers returned, now deafening, and with them came the feeling of being watched, an oppressive, malevolent presence that seemed to press against their very souls. The door slammed shut, and no matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. What happened next was never fully understood. A rescue team found their abandoned car days later, parked where the trail began. The group was never seen again, but locals claim to hear faint whispers when the wind blows through the trees at night, and sometimes, they say, if you listen closely, you can hear the low hum echoing in the distance, a warning perhaps to stay away.
Story number 2.
On a crisp autumn evening, 3 friends, Lila, Daniel, and Sam, decided to camp in an unmarked clearing deep within Blackwood Forest. The forest had a dark reputation, whispered about in local lore, but the trio dismissed the stories as nothing more than rural superstition. For them, it was a chance to escape the monotony of suburban life and experience something thrilling. The journey to the clearing was uneventful, though the woods seemed eerily quiet, the usual chatter of birds and insects conspicuously absent. They set up their tents under a canopy of skeletal trees, the fading sunlight casting long, twisted shadows. By the time night fell, the forest was cloaked in darkness, so absolute it seemed to swallow their lantern's light. Around the campfire, they joked and roasted marshmallows, their laughter a stark contrast to the oppressive silence pressing in around them. Then, at the edge of the clearing, they noticed it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. At first, they thought it might be another camper, though it was odd that someone would be out there alone. Daniel called out, his voice firm but friendly. "Hey, you lost or something?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the gnarled trees. Then it began to move, not walking, but swaying, its limbs twitching in unnatural jerks. Lila grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but the beam seemed to dissipate, as if the light itself was reluctant to touch it. "Maybe we should go," Sam muttered, his usual bravado faltering. Before they could decide, a sound pierced the air, a high-pitched wail like the cry of an injured animal. It came from the direction of the figure, but didn't seem entirely human. The sound grew louder, sharper, and then abruptly stopped. The figure was gone. Panicked, they retreated to their tents, agreeing to keep watch in shifts. Lila took the first turn, clutching the flashlight with trembling hands. Hours dragged by in tense silence, and just as she began to feel the weight of her eyelids, she heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails raking against fabric. It was coming from the side of her tent. She froze, barely daring to breathe, as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then, in the thin fabric of the tent, she saw the outline of a hand, long, bony fingers pressing against the material. She screamed, and the others bolted out of their tents, flashlights cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. The next morning, the group decided to pack up and leave. But when they reached the trail, it wasn't there. They retraced their steps, but the forest seemed unfamiliar, the trees impossibly dense. Hours turned into a full day of wandering, and the sun was setting once more when they stumbled back into the clearing where their campsite had been. Except it wasn't their campsite anymore. The tents were gone, replaced by a circle of blackened earth and charred bones. Symbols were etched into the ground, crude and primitive, their meanings lost to time. At the center of the circle stood a single totem, a twisted mass of wood and bone, its surface slick with what looked like fresh blood. Then they heard it again, that wailing cry, only this time it surrounded them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their movements disjointed and wrong, as if their limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. The friends huddled together, paralyzed by fear as the figures drew closer, their faces shrouded in darkness. The lantern they carried flickered, its weak flame illuminating one of the figures for the briefest moment. What they saw defied explanation, a face devoid of features, save for a gaping mouth that stretched far beyond the bounds of anything human. The lantern went out. No one ever heard from Lila, Daniel, or Sam again. Their families organized search parties, combing through Blackwood Forest for weeks, but no trace of them was ever found. Locals, however, claimed to have seen strange lights in the woods at night and heard distant cries echoing through the trees. Some say the forest is cursed, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. Others warn that if you venture too deep into Blackwood Forest, you might not come back. Not as yourself, anyway.
Story number 3.
A group of 6 co-workers, Mia, Alex, Jordan, Claire, Ethan, and Sophie, planned a weekend retreat in the remote wilderness to bond and unwind from the stress of their office jobs. They rented a cabin far off the beaten path, nestled in the heart of the sprawling Pine Ridge forest. The cabin was old but sturdy, with a fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The first night was uneventful. They drank wine, played games, and laughed into the early hours. But as the clock neared midnight, the laughter began to fade. The forest outside the cabin felt alive, the trees whispering secrets in the breeze. A heavy, oppressive feeling seemed to settle over them, though no one wanted to admit it. Around 2 a.m., Mia suggested they go to bed. As they were cleaning up, Ethan froze near the window. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Sophie replied, joining him. "There was someone out there, I swear." The others gathered at the window, peering into the inky darkness. At first, there was nothing but the faint outlines of trees. Then, from the corner of their vision, they all saw it. A figure standing motionless between the trees, just beyond the edge of the cabin's porch light. It was tall, its face obscured by shadows, and it didn't move. "Probably just a hunter," Alex said, though his voice lacked confidence. They locked the doors and windows and went to bed, each of them uneasy but too embarrassed to show it. At 3:17 a.m., Mia was jolted awake by a noise, a soft but insistent tapping on the window near her bed. Her heart raced as she sat up, the cabin eerily quiet except for the rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Summoning courage, she pulled the curtain aside. Nothing was there. She lay back down, her body tense when she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it came from the opposite wall, where there wasn't a window, only solid wood. She bolted upright and ran to wake the others. As she explained what had happened, a low, guttural moan echoed through the cabin, sending chills down their spines. It seemed to come from inside the walls. The group armed themselves with whatever they could find, fireplace pokers, kitchen knives, even a heavy lamp. They decided to stick together and investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. But as they moved through the cabin, it became clear that something wasn't right. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, and faint whispers drifted through the air, too quiet to understand but loud enough to unsettle. Doors they had left open were now closed, and objects seemed to move on their own. Then they found it. In the corner of the living room, behind the couch, a trapdoor they hadn't noticed before. Dusty and nailed shut, it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. But as they stood staring at it, the moaning grew louder, more insistent. "Don't," Claire said, her voice trembling as Alex reached for the hammer. "We need to know," he replied, his hands shaking. He pried the nails loose, the sound of creaking wood setting their teeth on edge. As the trapdoor swung open, the group recoiled from the stench that poured out, an overwhelming mix of rot and decay. Alex shone his flashlight into the dark void below. The beam revealed a small, dirt-floored room. Bones, animal and human, were scattered across the ground. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, dripping with a black, tar-like substance. Then they saw it, a figure crouched in the corner, its back to them. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its head twisted toward them with a sickening crack. Two hollow, black pits where eyes should have been stared back at them. It lunged, the flashlight clattered to the ground as chaos erupted. Screams filled the cabin, and the group fled, scrambling out into the freezing night. They ran through the forest, branches tearing at their clothes and skin, the creature's guttural cries echoing behind them. By the time they reached the road, the sun was beginning to rise. A passing car stopped and they piled in, breathless and bleeding. When they tried to explain what had happened to the driver, he shook his head gravely. "You shouldn't have stayed there," he said. "That cabin's been abandoned for years. Folks say it's cursed." When they returned with authorities later that day, the cabin was gone. Only an empty clearing remained. No trapdoor, no bones, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But the group was left with the scars of that night, both physical and mental. And sometimes, when they closed their eyes, they could still hear the tap.